All right, I think we're about ready to start. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to our webinar today. Thanks for joining us on this kickoff event to our webinar series, A New Wave, addressing the contemporary use of private military and security companies in armed conflict and complex environments. This event is co-hosted by DCAF, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, and the UN Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries. My name is Samuel Kung. I'm a project officer at DCAF. In this first event, we will aim to illustrate some of the main shifts in recent years in the private military and security industry, discuss the current regulatory landscape, and map out some potential entry points to address existing regulatory challenges. In the following webinars that we're going to organize the coming months, we will then look at different cases specifically in specific countries. So if you have a special interest or idea for where that could be, please feel free to share that in the chat and the Q&A. We'll have 3 speakers today, and at the end we'll have a Q&A. So whenever you have a question or input, again, feel free to put it in writing, and we'll try to address as many of them as possible in the end. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. Jean-Michel Rousseau is Deputy Head of Division at the Business and Security Division of DCAF, where he works with businesses, governments, and communities to improve security and sustainable development, as well as the respect for human rights. Jean-Michel will introduce some terminology about PMSCs and mercenaries and share practical examples from his work as sort of an introduction. Jean-Michel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Samuel, and also from my side, a warm welcome to everybody. I'm very proud to be part with these 2 illustrated other panelists today, and thank you also to the UN Working Group for co-hosting the event, as we've done in a few occasions in the past. So it's a very timely event, and indeed I'll give a short introduction on DCAF's expertise on some terminology. I think just to preface, we'll be speaking, I think, about PMSCs and mercenaries today. I know that some people might use terminologies in slightly different ways, but I think the idea was to really have a broad view on the sector and see what are possibilities to address this increased, let's say, private security military actors that are active in armed conflict and other situations. And that just so we're trying to cover the whole bandwidth. Are we looking at new wave? I think we have we had in the 2000s, I think Sean will also talk about this. We had this the more classical, let's say, PMSC, where we had more an Anglo-Saxon background, and we obviously think all of us remember Afghanistan, Iraq, and then that which really put the industry in the spotlight. And then for some time there was less public attention paid to the sector, and then we've seen a resurgence lately. I mean, at DCAF we've been working on this now for more than a decade, and probably I think from our experience we wouldn't say that even when there wasn't a public spotlight, I mean there was still a sector that was active and working. But clearly in the last years we have seen a resurgence of public interest and political interest in the topic. And there are indeed, we can talk about whether, I think we will do that today, whether there's indeed a new wave, but there's definitely new characteristics that we're seeing in PMSCs and mercenaries as well. We have, I think, a number of new territorial states. So companies are not anymore necessarily coming from the Anglo-Saxon sphere only. They still do, but there's other countries that are now providing fielding, and I'll probably focus more on PMSCs down the line because it's more what we do, but also in terms of mercenaries as well. So I think we have a new set of states, home states that are fielding them. We've seen new territorial states where they're active. I think we think that in the 2000s, I think the focus, at least in public perception, the focus was on Afghanistan and Iraq, and we've seen an increase of countries where these types of actors are used, spreading out in the Middle East, in in settings like Syria, Yemen, Libya, but also then we've seen instances across Africa as well. Notably, I think those are the two prevalent continents right now, plus then also popping up in some other continents. And we're also seeing new kinds of contracting states. So the states, apart from private clients, also there, we've always had states that were contracting out services. And again, when we were looking more at Iraq and Afghanistan, I think the landscapes there was more reduced, and now we've seen a number of other states contracting such type of services. So I think that we'll also see in the presentations of my next two speakers. So to say, indeed, we'll talk about whether there's a wave or not, but we've definitely seen there's new characteristics, and I think an increased complexity, and that underlines the need, if possible, and I think that will also be in question in our discussion, the need and the possibility, is the need to regulate them better, oversee them better where possible, and also, what are the limitations of that, up to what point is that possible? And here I wanted to just, in a second part, say, of my presentation, just share, I think, a couple of insights under two big points from DCA's work. I think one is when it comes to international norms, and then the second one is what can be done at the national level. In terms of international norms, I think we've seen, the first wave of the 2000s sparked the development of norms. I mean, the Montreux document and the Code of Conduct, and there's ongoing discussions about whether this is enough, whether there should be a binding convention at the UN. But I think as opposed to the situation we had at the beginning of the 2000s, where there was discussion whether particularly PMSCs were operating in a legal vacuum, I think we are at a point where they are norms. I mean, it's soft law norms, but there's norms have been developed, have been used, have been implemented, and that has shown their added value. So I think there are norms that can be used. I think a key challenge right now is more like the political will to implement these norms. But I think as opposed to the beginning of the 2000s, when it was completely unclear where how this could be framed, I think there are norms in place that can be applied by states. The second point I want to make is on national level implementation. We from DCAF, and I know other people have done too, but speaking about our expertise, in the last 5 years, we've worked with more than 25 countries on reform processes to strengthen national frameworks. And I think obviously the key, having adequate laws in place is a key element. Obviously, it's laws and having designated regulatory structures. But the point I want to make is that the key challenge that we see is not looking beyond the law. The law, in itself can be very beautifully written, but it can also be a very beautifully written piece of paper that doesn't get applied. So I think, really looking at, strengthening the regulatory capacity of states and also the oversight capacities, by civil society, by the media, by national human rights institutions. I think that is a real, I think that's the core issue that we see in our work right now at the national level, really making sure that, that and indeed the laws get updated and stick, but that they also, then get really filled with life, and that there's really, a continuous follow-up, not just a regulation at a given moment and a company gets issued a license, but also that then throughout time there's continued follow-up, and also a sanctioning and accountability where this is required. And obviously, and that would be my last one, obviously this is something that, should apply to the states where the companies are active, like territorial states. But we also know that this often happens a lot of time in situations where states are weak. And I think today we're talking about armed conflict and other situations of violence. So, in these situations, generally the national state, the state where this is taking place is weak and can't necessarily always adequately regulate. And I think what we see and then I'm harking back to the discussions in the 2000s, is, the continuous need that also the other types of states that we're talking about, namely home and contracting states, also do their fair share of regulation and oversight. The states where the companies are based, the states that contract companies, also continue to have a crucial role to play in overseeing the sector. So just wrapping up, I think yes, we're seeing a higher complexity of the sector, PMSCs and mercenaries as well. We have available international norms for PMSCs. I think, we can, I think Sean will talk a lot about mercenaries. I think, from an international law perspective, there's also a norm in place, which would be that there shouldn't be mercenaries, but, so I think, but that's a more like a black and white norm. I think we have, in terms of international for PMCs, I think it's more practical, because I think it's, there are elements that can really be put into place, not just black and white, but regulatory elements. And we have the importance of national level, and there particularly the need to really strengthen national stakeholders, not just to have legal frameworks in place, but also to have national stakeholders that can really continue to do a follow-up, a monitoring, a regulation, and also hold perpetrators of human rights violations accountable for their actions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jean-Michel. Very well noted. I noted down that so norms exist, unlike in the early 2000s, and there's really a key challenge in implement these nationally and also having the political will to do so. I also noted down that it's important to have adequate laws, but we shall also not forget about regulatory and oversight capacities of states that need to be strengthened. And finally, of course, to also focus not only on the territorial states, but on the home states and contracting states, the sort of three-state logic that we also see in the Montreal document, for example. So now I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sorka Maglor, who is Associate Professor at the University of Copenhagen, and also an expert at the UN Working Group on the use of mercenaries. So I'm excited to hear your views from the angle of the UN Working Group on the use of mercenaries. Sorka, you have the floor.
Thank you, Samuel. And yes, I should make clear that today I am speaking in my working group capacity, and I'm happy to see so many people joining us. Lots of familiar names, but also lots of new names to me, at least. So thank you for joining us. It was interesting that Jean-Michel started out by talking about definition of what we're talking about here, and one of the things that needs to be understood about the working group, despite our title, we are the working group on the use of mercenaries, we do in fact actually have an explicit and specific mandate to look not just at mercenaries, but also mercenary related actors and private military and security companies. And we in fact have our own working definition of PMSCs to try and address the very broad nature of these companies and the services that they provide. And our definition focuses on the services that they provide rather than what they're called or how they self-identify. And so in doing this, we are better able to capture the human rights risks that PMSCs can pose, and of course that's absolutely fundamental to our mandate, which is a human rights mandate. So we're very much focused on what sort of activities do in fact count as private military and security services, and which of those services can increase or heighten the risks of human rights violations, and actually violations of the laws of war for that matter. Now, in terms of the topic today, the working group in the last couple of years has produced several documents, I think, that are of particular relevance and particular interest to today's topic. So first of all, in 2020, we published and presented a report on the evolving forms of mercenaries, and we presented that to the UN General Assembly, and we explicitly looked at contemporary armed conflicts and what sort of impacts we're seeing that are being caused by the involvement of mercenaries and or private military and security companies. And we've seen that there are several very specific trends that are emerging in relation to armed conflicts. Now, this would apply to international armed conflicts and also to non-international armed conflicts. So we can say, let's say there are 5 key trends that we identified in that report. First of all, that we are seeing an increase in the recruitment and the demand for mercenaries, mercenary-related actors, and PMSCs in contemporary armed conflicts. Secondly, we're seeing a particular increase in non-international armed conflicts, and of course we've got the proliferation of non-international armed conflicts, perhaps happening faster than international armed conflicts. Thirdly, we have the proliferation of armed non-state actors who don't necessarily meet the definition of mercenary under international law, but certainly can overlap in certain circumstances with PMSCs and with mercenaries. Fourth, we have so-called proxy wars. And that's a situation where we're seeing third-party countries being involved or intervening in situations of armed conflict without being parties to the conflict. And the examples that I'll talk about in a moment are all related to proxy wars. And finally, fifthly, we see a trend of asymmetry between the parties to the conflict in terms of the military capabilities that they have and the strategies that they have. So defining actors as a mercenary is extremely difficult, and unlike PMSC, there are international legal definitions of mercenaries in the Geneva Convention, Additional Protocol 1, Article 47, which sets out a complex and cumulative definition of mercenary, which is very, very difficult to satisfy. There are, it doesn't, and the Geneva Convention does not criminalize mercenarism. Article 47 of Additional Protocol 1 is only concerned with the prisoner of war status of mercenaries and explicitly denies them prisoner of war status, as they are not to be accorded that. And what we've seen in our recent allegation letters in relation to several different armed conflicts is that it can be extremely difficult to distinguish between mercenaries and private military and security companies because of the difficulty of defining what a mercenary actually is, and indeed meeting the definition of mercenary, not least because it's very difficult to prove intent. So you've got a subjective requirement. You've got to prove their intent to participate in the hostilities, and you've also got to determine that they're being paid substantially more than the regular armed forces. And again, this is very, very difficult to actually establish and prove. So just to briefly address 3 specific armed conflicts that the working group has dealt with in the last couple of years. One is an international armed conflict, and that's the armed conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And then we have two non-international armed conflicts in Libya and also in Central African Republic. And as far as the working group is concerned, these three cases illustrate very clearly the importance of having proper and effective international regulatory frameworks in place, as well as national frameworks, and that states have to be reminded that they have an obligation under international human rights law to protect abuses carried out by third parties, and that would include private actors, whether we're talking about mercenaries or whether we're talking about PMSCs. Now, let me just talk briefly about our case examples. One of the powers we're given as part of our mandate is the power to engage in dialogue with countries when we receive credible evidence of human rights violations. And we can write to governments as well as other actors, which could include PMSCs, through what's known as the communications process. And we do this on a regular basis. So we essentially write to the governments and any other actors, asking them to respond to the allegations, to elaborate on the allegations, to clarify the situation, to share any information that they might have about the situation in question, and also to ask what action has actually been taken by the government in terms of investigating any abuses or any violations, whether there has been any sort of prosecution and conviction, and if appropriate, punishment. Because as I said earlier, we are a human rights mandate, so this is what we're very focused on. So just very briefly to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, we sent an allegation letter in 2020. There was also a press release. The allegation letter was sent to Azerbaijan. We had credible evidence that Azerbaijan was using mercenaries, or certainly individuals who appeared to meet the definition of mercenaries. And the evidence we had was that they were being recruited and paid for via Turkey. And in particular, the Turkish private military security company was recruiting Syrians, particularly from northern Syria. Now these recruits, many of them were linked to existing armed groups in northern Syria, and there were also suggestions that they had previously been linked to war crimes in Syria. And it seemed clear that to us that Turkey and Azerbaijan were taking advantage of the the poor socioeconomic situation in in Syria, to recruit young men. The evidence we had was that there were up to 2,000 recruits in Nagorno-Karabakh, and that more were in fact being recruited, and that they were being offered up to $2,500 US dollars per month, as well as if anything happened to them, that there would be repatriation, and that there would be compensation for their families. And in the context of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, there were serious human rights concerns about the hostilities and the impacts on civilians. And the evidence we had was that the mercenaries themselves were also being killed, and there were issues around whether they were being repatriated or not. In terms of Central African Republic, This is where we have issued a public allegation letter and a press release in March 2021. We previously issued a joint allegation letter with other colleagues under the special procedures in 2018. But the allegation letter that we sent out earlier this year related to the use of Russian private military and security contractors in Central African Republic, popularly known as the Wagner group. And so again, we've got this proxy situation arising, as we saw with Turkey in Nagorno-Karabakh. And we wrote to Central African Republic and Russia, as well as companies that we had evidence were involved in the payment of these actors. And we were extremely concerned about ongoing allegations of human rights, very serious human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law. They cross the spectrum of human rights issues, from mass summary executions to arbitrary detention, torture during interrogation, forced disappearances, forced displacement of the civilian population, indiscriminate targeting of civilian facilities, violations of the right to health, increasing attacks on humanitarian actors, sexual and gender-based violence. And there were also suggestions that potential war crimes were in fact being committed by these actors. Now, Russia responded by saying that there were Russian instructors or trainers in Central African Republic, and that was on the basis that they were there on the basis of a bilateral agreement with the CAR government. Now, that in itself is not problematic, but where it becomes problematic is when these actors are engaged in the hostilities and they're involved in the fighting and are involved in human rights violations. And the evidence we had showed that this unregulated deployment of these contractors had heightened the risk of a very serious human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law. Russia pushed back against us, saying that we didn't have credible evidence of this, and that in any event, both mercenaries and private military and security companies were unlawful under Russian law. The third and final example that illustrates the key points that I mentioned at the beginning is Libya, and it's a situation of proxy war. We again sent an allegation letter to both sides in the Libyan conflict, so both to the GNA and to the LNA. And we were particularly concerned that, again, Turkish recruited Syrians were being deployed to support the GNA, and that Russian recruited mercenaries were being deployed to support the LNA. And again, in particular, it's this group that's popularly known as the Wagner group. And we recently issued another press release in relation to Libya, because despite noises that mercenaries were supposed to leave Libya, this didn't seem to be happening, and we've been very concerned about the impact on the elections in Libya, and the impact on the stability of the country. So as far as just to finish up, as far as the working group is concerned, the working group position is that states should in fact not recruit, use, finance or train mercenaries, and that at the domestic level they should have in place legislation that prohibits those activities, and this would bring states in line with the UN Convention on the recruitment, use, financing and training of mercenaries. At the moment, we only have 37 states that are a party to that treaty. There needs to be effective regulation of these types of actors at the international level as well. So we need to see more states becoming party to the UN Mercenary Convention and criminalizing mercenarism. And when there are the grave human rights abuses and violations of humanitarian law that, such as we've seen in CAR, in Libya and in Nagorno-Karabakh, then the international community has to make sure that a culture of impunity doesn't exist, and that the international community, in fact, ensures that states adhere to their human rights obligations and properly investigate, prosecute and punish human rights violations. There are some other conclusions that I can draw, but I think we have quite a bit of time for discussion, so perhaps I can bring up some of those in the discussions or in response to questions. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very much, Sorka. That was very interesting. I take with us that in terms of the definition, you say that you rather identify organizations or companies focused on the services rather than how they self-identify, that it's also difficult at times to even distinguish PMSCs and mercenaries, because there's a rather strict definition for mercenaries. For example, that they have to, their employees have to be paid considerably higher than other armed forces. I also take with me that there's an increase in recruitment and demand for mercenaries and PMSCs in contemporary conflict, increases in non-international armed conflicts, a proliferation of armed non-state actors, more proxy wars, and a sort of a trend of asymmetry. Then you also mentioned three very contemporary examples of Karabakh, Libya, and the Central African Republic. And I think a sort of issue there that the unregulated displacement of contractors can augment the risk of human rights violations. And then finally, of course, the need or the stance of the working group that states should not, in fact, recruit, use, finance, or train mercenaries. And there needs to be regulation at the domestic level that also prevents that. And that we need effective regulation on an international level as well. Now I'd like to go to our final panelist for today. It's a pleasure to introduce to you Professor Sean McFate from Georgetown University, who is author of the book, The New Rules of War. And Sean will share with us quickly about his own experience as a contractor in different contexts, and then draw a bit on the changes in the PMSC and mercenary industry and the impact on sort of the global order. Sean, thank you. After floor.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with DCAF and the UN Working Group. We're actually trying to affect change in the world and not just report on it. Let me go to a brief slideshow, and I'm going to cover mercenaries because mercenaries are back. This seems to be uncontestable. How we define mercenaries, we'll save that for Q&A, but I'm going to discuss these illicit market actors briefly. And also, for some background, I was in this industry for several years. I was globally in this industry with a focus on Africa, which is not a surprise since Africa has a lot of conflict, which the mercenary world would call market opportunities, conflict markets. But I'm not here to confess prior sins. So to give you some scope of this, this was, mercenary operations, the big ones that were in the press 25 years ago. Now let's contrast that just in the last several years. We've seen this industry grow. Now the countries here that are maroon, that's where you see Russian mercenaries, primarily the Wagner Group, but there are other Russian mercenaries out there, and they are not necessarily all Russian citizens. They are Russian-speaking mercenaries. But the sort of the bluish turquoise green there, that's others as well. And you see, basically the mercenary world is, because it's an illicit industry, it's organized around command languages. A command language is the language that you give orders in, Russian or, English. And it's also the way they fight. So if you're a NATO country, you speak some English and you fight according to NATO tactics and strategy and doctrine. The Russians have their own version of that, and so do others. So it's actually not just a language, it's a sort of if you will, best practices, although that's kind of a perverse term to use here. So the three main language groups today are English, Russian, and Spanish. English, Russian, and Spanish. And there's some smaller ones like French and Hebrew and stuff. So why are mercenaries now appearing? We are seeing a third wave, it is true. Now we are seeing not just an emergence, but a free market for force has emerged. In Iraq and Afghanistan, it wasn't a free market, it was a monospony, meaning that you had one rich sugar daddy, which was the United States and UK, and they were sort of they were like the big client with market power. Now we're seeing a diversification of mercenaries, of supply, and a diversification of clientele as well. So supply and demand are diversifying. But what is driving this change? And what's driving this change is that warfare itself is changing. We live in a global, warfare is getting sneakier. That is what's going on. Warfare is getting sneakier. So now cunning wins over just brute force. And the reason why warfare is getting sneakier is because we live in a global information age. And in a global information age, weapons that give you, or military units that give you plausible deniability are more important than firepower. When everybody has an iPhone or an Android or something, everybody is suddenly a journalist, a photographer, an editor, and a publisher around the world. And if you want to get away with war, you have to wage it in the shadows. You have to wage it beneath the threshold, not of the laws of war, but beneath the threshold of BBC News and Fox News and CNN. Once sometimes you see it bubble up in high intensity conflict in like Libya, but then all sides try to bubble it back down into the shadows. Because if you want to wage war and win, you do what Russia did in Ukraine. You create the fog of war while the international community is still scratching its head about what's going on. You move your special forces through that fog of war. You move your mercenary groups like Wagner, Little Green Men, etc. And then the Crimea is a fait accompli. And once the Crimea was won, only then did Putin pull back the curtain and said, hey, it was us all along. So that's an example about how warfare is changing and how you win. Plausible deniability is key. And guess who gives great plausible deniability? Mercenaries. We're seeing mercenaries emerge the last 6 or 7 years. You see Nigeria use them against Boko Haram. And these mercenaries showed up not just with Kalashnikovs, they showed up with Mi-24 attack hind helicopters, like flying tanks. Now, Nigeria has a pretty strong military, but the advantage, quote unquote, of using mercenaries is that they can do potentially human rights violations that you don't want your troops caught doing. And where the Nigerian military could not push Boko Haram out of their northern territory over 6 years, the military and the mercenaries worked together, pushed them out in just a few weeks. That shows you the potential and the power of mercenaries. Libya is a mercenary on mercenary war these days. We don't even know about who's really fighting on the ground and why. It's not just, you know, Turkish mercenaries versus Russian mercenaries. You have mercenaries from Middle Eastern oligarchies or monarchies. You have private sector oil companies have mercenaries sniffing around the edges, doing a strategic reconnaissance. This is a modern war where it's all under the fog of war. In Yemen, we saw a lot of Latin American mercenaries and alleged ex-US soldiers like SEALs and Green Berets act as killer hit teams for Middle Eastern monarchy. This is where warfare is trending on the edges. And here's the problem. If this status quo is allowed to continue, supply attracts demand, which attracts more supply. So the more mercenaries enter the market, we already have a glut of mercenaries, you know, leaving, that got their start on the Iraq and the Afghan wars. Once those contracts end, they don't just reintegrate into civilian society like, you know, World War II army guys. They look for new clientele, and suddenly new clients emerge. And this cycle continues and continues and continues, and it creates a security dilemma. So, you know, when you commodify conflict, conflict's the one commodity that can create its own demand signal through racketeering, extortion, prey, etc. So here are some risks if this trend were to continue into the mid 21st century. And this is based on loads of history of examples of this, particularly in Europe. You know, in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, mercenaries were how you fought wars. Very few people invested into a standing national army. And even like popes had mercenary armies. And the problem with this is that contract enforcement is almost impossible. It's a very Machiavellian might makes right. And so there was lots of treachery on both sides. You had mercenaries ripping off their masters, masters ripping off their mercenaries. Popes were big deadbeats. They'd never pay their mercenaries. And this caused lots of problem. Also, mercenaries, when you link warfare with profit motive, without any constraint at all, then mercenaries are incentivized by profit to start and elongate wars, which increases human suffering. You only have to look at the 30 Years' War, if not much earlier, to see what that does. It also lowers the barriers of entry. So now the super rich can become superpowers through the power of armed violence. You also see more criminality because out of work mercenaries will often engage in racketeering, extortion, they will become bandits, and then they will sell their protective services to a town or to a client saying, you know, just like the mafia, saying, if you want us to protect you, you have to pay us. Obviously, the lack of safety and accountability in armed conflict goes down the drain. You also have the risk of Praetorianism, sort of a Praetorian guard where you'll have state capture. And this is how many aristocrats in medieval Europe got their start. They were actually warlords, or we call them feudal lords. So looking at like the Forza family in Milan in the 14th and 15th century, he began as a mercenary captain. Or they engage in shakedown sort of tactics. They go up to the client when the client needs their services the most, and they demand 3 times their fee or else. They can also manipulate information. And I saw this when I was actually in the market for force. You know, the client, it's like if you want to remodel your kitchen and it costs 20,000 euros, And the only source of information about whether you need something or not is your actual contractor, the guy who's doing the repair. There's a conflict of interest for that contractor to say, well, you need to replace all of your plumbing in your kitchen, which could be very expensive. And you don't know if you need to do that or not. And that's what mercenaries do. They do the same thing. This, of course, changes war in ways that our four-star generals have no comprehension of. You're introducing market strategies with military ones. It's like, Clausewitz, who's meets Adam Smith. When you marketize war, then suddenly the strategies of eBay work in war. You try to outbid your opponents. You try to bribe their mercenaries from under them. The Italian wars of the 13th, 14th century are good examples of this. And lastly, there's going to be a proliferation, as we've seen, because regulating this industry is extremely difficult, because even if you have the regulation in place, who's going to go into Libya and arrest all those mercenaries? These mercenaries can shoot your law enforcement dead. And this is why mercenaries are the second oldest profession in the world. So just quickly wrapping up, the more mercenaries are in the world, the more they will attract new clientele. And those won't always be states. They will be the super rich as well, because now the barriers of conflict are lowered. So anybody could swipe a check, can wage war for whatever reason they want. And if this continues in a couple of decades, we might see wars without states. I mean, imagine ExxonMobil gets its own military and a rival oil company gets its own military and they fight for natural resources. Or just imagine a mega church wants to hire mercenaries to do humanitarian intervention in a place like Libya. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why mercenaries can be used, and we're seeing more private sector using them. So fortunately, we can still do well. I talk about these dynamics in my book called The New Rules of War, which I can talk about separately, but it talks about how war is increasingly privatized. And should this trend go forward, it's going to change international relations as we know it, because suddenly those who have lots of money can wage lots of war, and that will change the distribution of power in the international system. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was very insightful. I take with me some of the changes that you discussed. First of all, interesting notes on the command languages, both of, for example, NATO, but also the mercenary-like organizations of like English, Russian, Spanish. Then you also talked of a third wave of mercenaries that now a more diversified market has emerged, unlike the monopsony that we had before in early 2000s in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also the diversification of the clientele of mercenaries and mercenary-like organizations. Then, of course, the importance of the global information age and plausible deniability. I think that's definitely something we will take with us. And then the different risks that you also mentioned. I really liked also on your slide the sort of cycle that you described of a supply that attracts demand, which attracts more supply in the end. And I'm happy to discuss further, or for you panelists to discuss further, how we can address this. And then, of course, in the end, looking forward, I think that's definitely something that we as an international community need to think about. What happens if wars are more and more privatized, and are there going to be private sides on both sides? And what does that mean for international regulatory mechanisms? Now, we have already a few questions, but before we go into these, I would like to give maybe a minute or two to each panelist to address the following question. Now, I think we discussed already quite a bit about whether or not there is a new wave. I think there's a certain agreement that there's definitely new characteristics of organizations and companies in the market for speed, more on the PMSC side or the mercenary side. Now, what I wonder, and I think participants to this panel probably and to also do, is what about now we said and underlined over and over that the importance of regulating them internationally and nationally. Now, I would like to hear from the panelists, are the international regulatory mechanisms that exist currently with the Montreal document, International Code of Conduct, the negotiation on a binding treaty on PMSCs and so on, are those appropriate and sufficient to regulate the current PMSC and mercenary industry? And if not, where do we see potential entry points to address these regulatory gaps, should they exist? Maybe Jean-Michel, do you want to start off?
Thank you, Samuel. I think it's a very important question you're raising. And I think, I partly, I think, also already tried to address it in my opening remarks. I think I think we do have norms in place. We do have, there are norms that are available and that states can draw on. And I think we, these norms could be, strengthened and, be more explicit on a number of things. But I think the key challenge, that's maybe more my personal take than institutional take, but I think it's really about the political will to implement them, to make it work. We could aim for more perfect norms, but I think the biggest reason there's risks and violations happening is because norms that already exist are not being implemented. I think if all the norms we had already in place, and be them binding or non-binding, I don't want to go into discussion on binding versus non-binding, but if what we have already as a construct would be applied, then I think we would be the situation would be a lot different and a lot more positive. So I think right now, and I think that's also why, as an organization, I think we're putting a lot of focus on the national level on the implementation. I think so I'd say for me, it's more a question of political will about states, and states, but I mean, not just the governments, but I think, societies in general, putting the focus on, really like strengthening the relation and using, relying on what there's already out there, because, I mean, just on a side note, I think we've, and maybe Sorcha can also talk about this, but, from a technical perspective, I've followed the discussion on, for example, on the convention, and, I wasn't invited experts in some of the last meetings. And I think the point that basically everybody made in the discussion was, the convention should draw upon the Montreal document and the Code of Conduct, etc. So I think there's a consensus, I think, saying that, there are a lot of existing norms out there. I think then there's various shades on how people say whether they're enough or not. But I think, there are norms out there and they should be used as a basis. And, from my personal perspective, I think, we've worked in, I've worked with these norms, and I think they have been useful to states that we work with. So my point would be, I think it's really the key focus right now, I think, should be about, implementing them and having states follow up with them. And I think that's where the challenges are. There are states that, we've worked with that have updated their legislation and their regulation, and there are states who, for a variety of reasons, that haven't done so. And I think that's where the key focus should be.
Thanks very much. May I give the floor to you, Sorcha?
Thank you, Samuel. I think the thing speaks for itself. The fact that we are seeing this increase in the use of mercenaries or mercenary-related actors, or PMSCs who are, sort of straddling these categories, shows that the international regulatory framework is not working. And as I said, we only have 37 state parties to the UN Convention on mercenaries, which really illustrates, I think, the international community's ambivalence about mercenaries and mercenarism. And so you see very specific language being used. So you will have countries from the global north talking about legitimate private security providers, and talking about them in terms of, it's not very clear what legitimate means. I think legitimate really only means that they have been incorporated in some form, in some legal form, and that they are being hired by particular countries. It doesn't have any legal meaning. So I think we've got some problems there, and I think that those problems are playing out in the mechanism that's been set up to look at an instrument on PMSCs specifically. It's this is a process that's been around for several years now. The working group supports unequivocally an international instrument. But we've moved from looking at a treaty to looking at something that may be a treaty but may not be a treaty, and then in which case, well, we already have the Montreux document. So then why have an additional instrument? And I think I've been at numerous meetings of the open-ended intergovernmental working group. It's moving very slowly. We don't even have a draft yet. And I think states need to demonstrate their commitment to regulating in this area. And we're still having, I think even at the last meeting of the open-ended intergovernmental working group earlier this year, we were still debating definitions. And frankly, it feels like we're going round in circles, and we're having the same debates that we were having 15 years ago, around, not quite 15 years ago, but when the Montreux document was being discussed and debated and drafted, and also the International Code of Conduct. And so, and the International Code of Conduct, I think it also, it was brought about as a result of the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, not the sorts of situations that we're seeing here. And as Sean says, we're clearly seeing plausible deniability. If you look at the responses of Russia, of Turkey, of Azerbaijan, of CAR to all of our allegation letters, it's all nothing to see here. There are no mercenaries here. There are no human rights violations. All your allegations are unfounded, and that's as far as states are concerned. That's the end of the story. It's clearly not the end of the story.
Thank you very much. Very well noted. I think there's definitely a certain element of political feasibility that is a challenge for different international regulatory mechanisms as well as national ones. Also noted the point of plausible deniability. And now, before I give the floor to you, Sean, I'd just like to read one question that I think sort of fits in with that. Someone is asking, as plausible deniability seems to be the best sale argument of mercenary companies, how can we improve their accountability? So I think that goes in line with the question of what are the entry points to regulate them, to hold them accountable. Sean, you have the floor.
Yeah, the questioner is correct. It is indeed a chief selling point, which is why you have countries with strong militaries like Russia and others using mercenaries, is because they provide this in an information age. So I think, first of all, it is very difficult and maybe impossible to regulate this industry because, like I said, it's the second oldest industry in the world. There's a brief moment in time in some place in the late 17th and 18th centuries where states did regulate it by having the monopoly of force, but that has been devolving since at least the last 30 years. And we're going back to normal, which is the marketization of warfare. But if we were to do this, and we didn't want to have the United Nations have the monopoly of force by hiring its own mercenaries, then the way we would start is, I think we have to codify these norms and et cetera into an international national framework. But I was at some of those discussions 15 years ago or so with the Montreux drafting, and we are still haven't gone past the definition stage. So that's discouraging, but not surprising. The second to the, I think we can go after the clients. So the problem about modern mercenaries is that they can rebrand easily. So if they're caught in the spotlight, they just say, hey, it's not us. And we're a new company. We are Decaf and Co. or something like that. And so it's hard to chase them down. But some of their clientele are, you know, if it's a very rich person or a big multinational corporation or a state, they're not going to rebrand. But they are also very good at evading law, including how do you go after Nigeria or Russia? Also to the questioners thing about plausible deniability, the way you take away their chief selling point is through transparency. So let's find ways to empower journalists. Let's find ways to empower researchers who can shine the light of day, because as soon as you shine the light of day, then like, what's the business case for the Kremlin to use mercenaries if, you know, they can just use now special forces? Or that's what I say is like the answer may not be in legal affairs. It might be other things as well as this, and this is going to be controversial, but you can also try to tame the market by manipulating market mechanisms, right? By trying to, you tweak supply and demand. If there's a way you can do that by using market mechanisms, but the risk of that is that you may ultimately be encouraging a larger market for force. So it's a very difficult question.
Thanks very much. Well noted. A lot of interesting points, if I understand you correctly. First of all, you're saying we're more so going back to the normal with a more fragmented, more mercenary-based warfare that is, as we have also found, very difficult to regulate it on an international level. You're saying that we can also use market mechanisms maybe to address the market mechanisms that are there with a given risk of worsening the problem in the end. So definitely a very, very complex topic that we're dealing with. I'd like to go to one of the questions from participants. This is for Sorka from Christopher Mayer, and I'll just read it out loud. So both the UN Working Group and the Montreux definitions of PMSCs omit fighting in combat. Also, both definitions presume a corporate entity. How do you address the definitional gap between PMC and mercenaries presented by international irregular combat forces?
Yeah, thanks for that one, Chris. Always getting to the heart of things, huh? I mean, from the working group's perspective, this is where, you know, where the precise wording of our mandate helps us, because we have the mandate to look at mercenaries, mercenary related actors, and PMSCs. So and we're not a tribunal, so it's not for us to determine whether something is a mercenary or not. That is for an international tribunal or a domestic tribunal to decide. So you can see in our recent allegation letters, we say, for example, you know, that they appear to meet the international legal definition of mercenary. But you know, the group that everybody talks about as Wagner, you know, Wagner doesn't actually exist. It certainly doesn't have any corporate body as far as we're aware. And as I already said, Russia says that both mercenarism and private military and security companies are not permitted under Russian law, and mercenarism is in fact criminalized. And I think I don't think the definitional gap, as I said at the beginning, I think it only arises if you use specific terminology. Again, from the working group's perspective, we're interested in what they do and what the consequences are. So are there human rights violations being committed? Are there IHL violations being committed, and are they somehow related to our mandate? And then we can of course respond. Now, I recognize that that might not be the answer that you or others would want, but with my working group hat on, that is the answer you're going to get. That we don't have to address that gap because we have this very broad mandate.
Jean-Michel, did you have something to add?
Yeah, and maybe just to add as well, I think there's a number of services available on the market. I think Sorcha has explained. I think we can look at it, say, from a wide perspective on services, but even if you follow the logic of direct participation in utilities versus non-direct participation, I think the direct participation is oftentimes not feasible within other support being given. And that would be covered at least by by the non-participation. And so I think it's a bit of an iceberg. I mean, the tip is probably the participation in utilities, but that one wouldn't be possible with other services. So you could also try to address it through indirectly through other services as well. So just to add, it's a pyramid where there's a small number probably of direct participation at the top, but which is underfed by a significant number of other services that underpin it, and only they make it possible that there is even direct participation in hostilities.
Thanks very much, Jean-Michel. I'd like to go to the next question. I'll just read it. So one participant asks, is the international community serious about helping by removing Turkish and Russian mercenaries? I think it's formulated a bit daringly, if I may say, but I think it's a question that merits attention, as in, like, can we improve or increase political pressure also on countries for which we might believe that they don't use PMSCs or mercenaries appropriately? Is that potentially even a lever to improve international regulation? Is there anyone who would like to say something about that issue?
I literally just put a link in the chat. 10 days ago, it was announced that a new strategic plan for the removal of mercenaries from Libya has been put in place. So I think it's fair to say, to that extent, that the international community is serious. I think there's been pressure being put on both sides in Libya to do that. And of course, the working group on the use of mercenaries has certainly used what pressure it can bring to bear on the situation to urge the removal. So I think there is some seriousness. Whether the reality will meet the plan remains to be seen. I wouldn't want to be too pessimistic about it, but I'm not necessarily entirely optimistic either. I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe just to add, I think that we've done a bit of work on Libya, and we had a webinar also some months ago on Libya from TCAF's side, and I think the fact that there is a plan now, I think and I agree with Sorcha that we'll see how it gets implemented, but I think the fact that there's a plan, I think, shows the recognition that this is an important issue. It's not something that's considered as it's not something that pops up in a footnote, as some under wider issues. I mean, this is one of the key issues that have been identified. And I think it's one of the first times that there's a specific plan, under a UN process specifically for, and we can, again, I don't think we're going to like a specific discussion on terminology, but for private actors there on the ground that are that are there and are contributing to hostilities. And I think that in itself is already is a signal that this is being taken seriously. I can't necessarily speak to the implementation, but I think the fact that the plan exists, I think, is something that shows that these actors are being taken serious.
Thanks very much. I just read now in the chat, one participant is also saying about the avoiding of responsibilities by state actors, suggesting that one way to address this is to follow the money and prove that it goes directly to state sponsors. But it has to be evidence that you could prove in court. Now, I think that opens sort of a question about transparency. We talked about it a little bit already. Sork also mentioned the issue of deniability, as did Sean. I would like to give the question to Sean, if you don't mind. Is that one thing that we can do also to address the issue, to address transparent or intransparency, gather more information about the industry to better regulate it?
Yes, I mean, as Cicero once said, money is the sinews of war, and especially with this industry. So if you could do investigations, you can follow the money, which of course is very difficult, but it can be done. I mean, one of the greatest tools I think of shining the light and letting the cockroaches flee at night is that is publicly available information, or as what the intelligence community calls OSINT, open source information. There is so much you can get on the web these days through web scrapers and stuff like that. And savvy journalists and savvy researchers can really harness this. I mean, to some extent, I think they're ahead of the CIA and ahead of the government intelligence agencies that like to privilege secret confidential information, which was really cool in the 1950s. But in 2020, you might be able to get 80% of what you need through open source information. So investigations through following the money and looking at shell companies. I mean, look at Eric Prince. He was the former, he was the founder of Blackwater. There's investigative journalists about him, and I think there's lots of potential. And then it's not just can you sue them, but also can you name and shame them? Because if a mercenary company or its individuals are identified, they're going to be toxic in the industry. They're not going to have any clients want to talk to them because they're like busted. So this is you need to do more than this, but it's one way of helping shutting down this industry is the power of information and bringing it to light.
And maybe just to add on this, I think, media and civil society are often, I think when we talk about this, are a bit an overlooked part in because we have civil society that's very active and very well informed at the national level, like the local level, plus like journalists that have done active investigations or that could do active research. And I think it's important to also work with these actors to strengthen their capacities to also adequately oversee, because indeed they are some of the best sources by their local knowledge in terms of bringing abuses to light. And often they the government has certain capacities, the private sector will have very well-funded one. Civil society and media often don't have enough capacities, but with a bit of push, I can actually come up with some very credible information, and so a bit of support can go a long way.
Thanks very much. So definitely important to keep in mind the importance of information, potentially also partnerships to gather information and to spread it as well. I have one more question here about the UN Mercenary Convention to Sorka. What do you think about the issue that there are many cases where mercenaries are used in one-sided violence and not necessarily in armed conflicts, and therefore are not covered by the UN Mercenary Convention? Is there a way to get around this issue?
Well, as I said in response to the chat, that this is where domestic regulation comes to comes to the fore. If you can't persuade states to sign up to a convention, then you can you can still encourage them to regulate the different relevant actors, or the services, at least, as we would suggest, at the national level. And of course, that's the the route that the Montreux document takes. The Montreux document is essentially brings together all of the existing international legal provisions that are relevant for the regulation specifically of private military and security companies, and encourages states to regulate at the domestic level. And this is where there's a huge gap. The international law is not always the solution. I'm very much in favor of these hybrid approaches to regulation. That yes, it's important to have top-down international law, but it's also important to have regulation at the domestic level. And this is states, again, this is from very much from, of course, from the human rights perspective, but states need to remember their human rights obligations. And as I said earlier, it's about investigation, prosecuting, and if appropriate, punishing human rights violations or violations of IHL. And that's across the board. That's not just in relation to private actors. So states have an obligation under international human rights law to put in place mechanisms and processes and systems to deal with human rights violations. And as I said, that that protection extends to private actors, no matter what we call them. But if it's what they're doing in terms of the abuses and the violations that's important. That's, I think, in terms of remedying pre-existing or ongoing human rights violations, having those mechanisms in place is crucial. But what we ideally want to do is to stop those violations happening in the first instance. So we would want to make sure that states are not outsourcing services that are resulting in participation in armed conflicts, participation in hostilities, and they should do that domestically, but they should also make sure that they are not exporting these kinds of services. And that's exactly what we've seen happening in the examples that we've been talking about today. So international law is useful. Domestic law is also useful.
Thanks very much. Again, a number of good points. I think, firstly, what you also mentioned, next to top-down approaches, the importance of bottom-up approaches. And I think I don't know if anyone else wants to react, but we haven't talked so much about other actors. Sean mentioned the market sort of dynamics, the clients. I don't know if we see also a specific role for academia in gathering of information, or civil society organizations, as well as other non-state actors. I don't know if anyone wants to elaborate on other actors that could be helpful in regulation of PMSCs.
Could I add,
Please.
ironically, private intelligence companies could help.
Okay. Would you wish to elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh, sure. I mean, so there's a private military industry. There's also a private intelligence agency. Think of, privatized CIA. And they usually serve like multinational corporations of rich people. They tend not to serve governments because they don't want to get busted. So they do human operations, like they run human networks. They do signal operations, like they intercept cell phones. And there's a lot of cyber mercenaries or cyber intelligence firms that do things too. And these two industries, the private military world and the private intelligence world, merge at some level. Now, the private intelligence world is pretty small and pretty boutique. In the English-speaking world, they're centered in London, New York City, and Washington, D.C. They're mostly ex-spooks. And they're kind of small, but ironically, you could pay them to find and track mercenaries. So you're using market power against market power. But it could also create other risks as well.
Thanks very much. I think now we are getting to the end of our questions. Thanks so much to all the panelists. It's been very insightful. To finish up, I'd just like to give the floor to each of the panelists once more, in case anyone wants to make a final statement about what we can do to improve regulation of PMSCs in armed conflicts and complex environments. Do you wish to start, Jean-Michel?
Thank you. No, look, I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and not that much to add from my point. I think, we've talked, I think, about the role that I think the private sector has, and I think there are indeed private clients to these endeavors. So I think it's important there, and I think we're a bit at a funny age, because there's more space for this information, but there's also this focus. I mean, there's also more transparency on some issues, so there's this space also to engage on credibility and on being corporate citizens. And I think we have a whole discussion around the UN Guiding Principles and National Action Plans on Business and Human Rights, and we've been involved in seeing how can we include private security in these settings as well. So to have it from a business focused perspective, and there some tendencies will point towards business being less accountable. On the other side, business also are claiming to be more corporate citizens and accountable because of that. So I think that's one thing to use to increase the regulation. Civil society and media, I've already talked about. I think also other actors, National Human Rights Institution, I think are also an important actor in this way. And the last point I want to say also, we've talked a lot about the state now as a regulator, somebody that issues norms, but the state in a lot of countries is also a huge client of private actors. And particularly, I think, I work in Latin America a lot. In Latin America, the state is a huge client of private security companies, and they do everything from guarding ministries to guarding schools and transportation hubs, etc. And a lot of times what we see is that the state doesn't use its economic leverage at all to pressure for a better sector. So the state will issue public procurement, but then the criteria will basically be the same as if the state was buying washing machines or new computers, but there's no mentions there about human rights standards and adequately trained guards, etc. So I think beyond the legal provisions that are in the law, I think the state should also a lot of states should also up their economic ante and really use public procurement as a leverage, because they do have a huge leverage on the sector. Granted, I think there's a couple of companies that we've talked about in this seminar that will probably not fall within a normal public procurement procedure, so to speak. But I think a good part of the sector, could be better addressed also through public procurement. And I think we won't be able to address the whole sector at once in any case. But I think there's a chunk of the sector. We have the very progressive companies that in any case I think are playing by the rules, and then the ones that will be very hard to regulate. But there's a big chunk in the middle that I think we could make a better intent of addressing, both through regulation, but also through this economic leverage that states have over these companies. And also keeping in mind we need a level playing field, which in a lot of countries there isn't, because it's only about the price. So the cheapest and the least regarding companies in terms of human rights wins. But I think really looking at this market for force, understanding what are the economic motivators. It is an industry, and how can we use that to push it further, I think would be a very important step also going forward.
Thanks very much, Jean-Michel. Sean, what do you think? What are your final thoughts on this issue?
Well, look, I try to track mercenaries and not it's a nuanced market. I'm looking at the worst part of it. I'm skeptical about the power and utility of international frameworks, but that doesn't mean that they don't matter. They do matter. I do believe that the best way to defang the industry is to make it transparent, because then it loses a lot of its appeal. And so let's find ways to empower civil society and engage, in some name and shame. There, of course, are risks with that. But I think the last thing we want is an industry that's unbounded, where we have, Fortune 50 companies waging war against other Fortune 50 companies. That might sound like science fiction in 2020. But if you said 20 years ago that we were having this conversation, that would sound like science fiction too.
Thanks a lot. That's indeed a very, very important point. Sorka, you have the floor.
Thank you. 3 quick points. I put a link in the chat to the Working Group on Mercenaries' latest report on cybersecurity, which will be presented to the UN General Assembly next week on the 28th of October. There was also another question in the Q&A about international volunteers who fought ISIS alongside the YPG. Are they to be considered mercenaries? This is that would be an example where domestic legislation is absolutely fundamental. I can give you one example in relation to Switzerland, where the working group, we did a country visit to Switzerland a couple of years ago, and under Swiss law, it's the offence of being a mercenary is strict liability under the military code of justice. So you don't have to satisfy the subjective elements of being a mercenary that's required under the international legal definition. Remember earlier I said that the subjective nature of intent, and also the element of proving that they were being paid more than the regular armed forces is a real problem in determining whether somebody's a mercenary or not. Switzerland gets round that and just criminalizes mercenarism, and basically says if you fight abroad and for a country that's not Switzerland, you're a mercenary, and it's very, very straightforward. So to answer that question, they wouldn't necessarily be determined to be mercenaries under the Geneva Convention, or even the UN Convention on mercenaries, but they might be considered to be a mercenary under the domestic law of the home state. And my third point was just to make a plea for states to properly engage with, in particular, the open-ended intergovernmental working group on PMSCs. There's an opportunity here for states to define the scope of permissible private military and security services, and really clarify what regimes for registering, licensing, vetting, training, oversight, accountability, all of those elements, what they should look like, and alongside that, they should also be supporting the Montreux document and the International Code of Conduct. I think it's interesting that states default to talking about the Montreux document as being the solution here, when I think there are 57 participants at the Montreux document forum, which in the great scheme of things is what, about a quarter of all states. So if states are really serious about regulating these types of actors, then they need to step up and engage at all levels.
Thank you so much, Sorka. I think at this point we will wrap up the meeting. Let me thank again to our panelists and our partners from the UN Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries. Check out their new report on cybersecurity. Also check out Professor Sean McFade's book on the new rules of war, and stay tuned, because this is, as I said, this is the kickoff kickoff event, and we'll hold a number of webinars on specific cases on PMSCs in armed conflicts and complex environments. Thank you very much, and goodbye.